Imad, everything comes back to its origins, and whenever I'm in England, and in London in particular, I feel that I come back to one of my origins, because this is where I learned economics, and this is where I learned humanity, in the picket lines at Wapping, during 1984, during the miners' strike, during the picket lines of the steelworkers' unions, in all those great rallies to free Nelson Mandela. So, we are coming back to our origins, aren't we? Speaking of origins, and since you wanted some Greek etymology, I'll pick up from where Anne left off. Not that it's easy, because she gave us such a tour de force. I'll just pick up from some strands of that tour de force from the galaxy that we visited just now with Anne Pettifor. Take the Greek word for debt and the Greek word for money. It's the same origin, the same etymology. Χρέος and χρήμα. And indeed, it's the same origin, maybe you didn't know that, Anne, as utility. So utility, money and debt is the same word, more or less, different versions of the same word. And this is important because looked at generically, we are all in each other's debt. We are all together in this human project. So when you borrow the tools of your neighbor to fix something in your home, and you say, I'm in your debt, this is part of the collaborative design of humanity. And it is a debt, is it not? If you look at the first forms of money, it was variants of debt. So it was, for instance, in Assyria, in Mesopotamia. This is where we have the first evidence, archaeological evidence of money. They were pieces of clay on which there was an obligation, a debt obligation. Workers were being paid in those, and effectively they made them the owners of future parts of the harvest in which they were participating. Something dramatic happened, beginning here in Britain, with the Industrial Revolution and the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The sequence between production, distribution, and debt was reversed. In feudal societies, not that they were wonderful societies, in slave-owning societies, you had the sequence of production, distribution, and credit, or debt. So, the peasants worked, they produced the harvest was then distributed, usually forcefully. The sheriff would come and take a cut on behalf of the baron, sometimes by means of force, but that was a distribution of income of the produce. And then finally, the baron would sell the surplus that he had and accumulate money from which he would then lend to people. So credit and debt came at the end of the chain. But with the enclosures and the creation of labor as a commodity, which came after the expulsion of peasants from the land, and that conversion suddenly of the land into a commodity which was rented and bought and sold once it had been freed, emancipated from the workers, from the peasants, that at the very same time created the peasants as a proletariat, as people who could only survive by selling their labor for a price, because before that they were producers who simply kept what the sheriff did not take. Suddenly we had production organized, beginning with debt, moving to distribution, and then ending with production. How did it happen? The entrepreneur, probably an ex-peasant, would organize production, would rent the land from the landlord. How would he rent the land? By borrowing from the landlord or from some money lender. So debt comes right at the beginning. The same entrepreneur hires workers. This is distribution. This is how much money you get before production begins, and then production took place. This reversal allowed enormous wealth to be created as a result of capitalism and enormous deprivation. This is, if you want, the great paradox of capitalism, the contradiction. Amazing productive capacities were unleashed together with amazing capacities for deprivation and human misery. So debt suddenly becomes far more functional in moving history very fast. History before that was measured in the centuries. After that, it was measured in the decades. And all the gimmicks that we have in our pockets, our phones, our watches, and all that, they are the result of this process. So debt, this is an expression you've heard many times before, is to capitalism that which hell is to Christianity. Unpleasant, but absolutely functional and essential. It doesn't work without it. And this is where the universe that Anne was describing was born. Suddenly the banker becomes central in this turbocharged production system. Suddenly the banker is the person who has the capacity to take his long arm and push it through, if you want, a membrane separating the present from the future, push his hand to the future, grab value that has not been produced yet, bring it into the future, give it to the entrepreneurs to use it in order to create the production that will generate the wealth with which the future will be repaid. The tragedy, however, here is that this banker suddenly has power over the rest of society that not even the capitalist has. And once you have this power, then you go from the clouds and from the surface of the earth to the galaxy. Let me just give one example of these betting slips that Anne referred to. Imagine you have an investor who maybe on behalf of other investors purchases shares. Right? And let's say you think that this particular share of, what is it called, Square Root Drinks Company, they go public, and you think that they're going to do very well, and there's going to be a 50% increase in the share value by next year. So you buy a lot of that. Yeah? But then imagine that you can also buy some insurance against that, because you think, well, what happens if it doesn't go up by 50%? I will buy an option to sell my shares at a minimum price and pay some money for that. It's like buying an insurance that if the price does not increase by this much, well, you won't, or maybe declines, your bet doesn't work out, that you will be able to sell them at a certain minimum value, minimizing your losses. But then imagine that somebody comes to you with this idea that, hang on a second, maybe you should buy the right to purchase more of those shares at the existing price. So this is not an insurance, this is the opposite of an insurance. And this is like a bet, but you buy an obligation. Now, if you think that the share price is going to go up from 100 to 150, and you buy the obligation to buy next year when it is 150 at the price of 100, you've made a lot of money. And people will then want that betting paper, that obligation, they may want to buy it off you before the year passes. And then you realize that you're making a lot of money out of purchasing these pieces of obligations, and then you think, well, why buy the shares? Just buy those pieces of paper. But and if everybody believes, like you're believing, that this company is going to go up in price, then everybody wants to produce and sell these things to you, and everybody makes a lot of money out of it. But at some point, you realize that you have an obligation to buy 1 trillion of these shares next year. And what happens if that share is worth 10, not 150? Then suddenly you have trillions of a black hole. So this is the, if you want, because repetition is the mother of study, as the Latins used to say. I repeated some of the things that Anne said. But let me now go to a territory which is more closely associated with my person as the recovering former finance minister of Greece. In 2010, the Greek state went bankrupt. 2 points to make about this. Firstly, why did it go bankrupt? Well, firstly, because we created a kind of monetary system in Europe that resembles the 1920s, the gold standard of the 1920s. But I don't have time to explain this in the detail that I would want to. So I will tell you a story. It's 2011, a little bit before I met Anne, before that Berlin conference. late 2011, and I'm flying from Frankfurt, which is where I'm going tonight, to New York City. And I'm sitting next to a guy called Franz, who used to work for Deutsche Bank, since you mentioned Deutsche Bank. But not that, he was retired, because he had a stroke. And he told me the story, you know, you're on this plane for 10 hours sitting next to someone. He told me his life story. He said, you know, Yanis, life was brilliant until we created the euro. Why? Why for him? He said, look, before 1998, because this is more or less when the euro was created, I was the master of Europe. I would fly to Rome, to Madrid, to Athens. I was feted by bankers, by ministers, by mayors who wanted to borrow from me, from Deutsche Bank. They would take me to the opera, to the nicest restaurants. They would give me their business plans. They would try to convince me that they are fantastic, that they are amazing, that I'll get my money back with interest and so on. I would take it easy. I would look at them and say, yeah, I'll think about it. Then I would go back to Frankfurt. I would take a week, and then I would decide who gets the loans and who doesn't. And then I said, what happened then? I said, when the euro began, suddenly life wasn't worth living. Suddenly I had a quota from headquarters to lend more than 2 billion a week. Suddenly I was going to Athens, I was going to Rome, I was going to Madrid, and I was begging them to take the money from me, because if I didn't lend that money to them, my bonus was jeopardized, and maybe my job was jeopardized, and that's how I had my stroke. This is how our countries ended up with all this debt. Because Deutsche Bank suddenly realized that the more debt it created, the more of these betting slips, the more it managed to push them through to other institutions, foolish institutions like Deutsche Bank that were buying it, Royal Bank of Scotland and so on, from them. And this money, this merry-go-round, every time they were selling these pieces of debt to each other, they made more money, and they had to make even more money, and even more of that debt was built up. So that was the first point I wanted to make about Greece. 4 minutes? I think you are being very generous. Anyway. And then the second point I want to make. So, 2010, early 2010, that was when, until then, I was a very happy economics professor writing obscure articles and books that no more than 20 people read. Life was great for me too. I became prominent, at least in Greece, because I wrote an article saying, we are bankrupt, let's embrace our bankruptcy. Let's not try to extend it and pretend it. Extend it in the future by borrowing more, pretending that we're not bankrupt because we've borrowed. And of course, you realize that I became a national traitor, somebody who was going against the interests of the country by declaring Greece to be bankrupt and so on and so forth. And lo and behold, a few months later, May 2010, what happened? The Greek bankrupt state received the largest loan in history, 110 billion, not only in relative terms, in absolute terms, on condition that our income will shrink. That's what austerity does. Now, how old do you need to understand? Let's imagine this. Knock on wood, you lose your job, or your income is reduced, and you can't repay your mortgage. You can't meet your mortgage repayments every month, every week. And the bank comes to you and says, well, we have a solution. Here's a credit card. Draw from it to meet your repayments for the next few months, weeks. And this is the funny part. This is the hilarious part. We will do this on condition that you promise to shrink your income further. Now, an 8-year-old, my daughter, she was 8, I explained this to her, she said, that's stupid. The Greek government, the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission thought it was a great idea. Okay? And this is why Greece has entered a nosedive, and we're still in it. Now, January 2015, about a year ago, on the basis of this argument, I was elected to Parliament, and I was appointed finance minister. First thing I did was to go to Brussels, to Frankfurt, to Washington, where the IMF is, and to say to them, folks, you know, what we've been doing for the last 5 years, my daughter tells me it's stupid, and I think she's right. I have it on very good authority. And can we please start from scratch here. And I'll tell you what happened. Not in any great detail, because there's no need for a great detail. I was sitting down with the head of one of those institutions. I'm not going to tell you her name. I'm not. No, I believe in confidentiality. No, I don't. Anyway, so we were sitting down after a long technical discussion on debt swaps that we needed to do and reform packages. And she said this to me. She said, Yanis, I know you're right. This program for Greece can't work. But you've got to understand something important. We have invested a lot of political capital in it. And your credibility, my credibility, depends on you accepting it. I didn't accept it. As of the next day, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, was depicting me as an irresponsible, time-wasting gambler who had nothing to say. You know why? Because I was refusing to sign on the dotted line of another loan agreement, which was impossible to meet in terms of its obligations, and whose implementation condemned Greece to a deepening of the Great Depression.